Hello and welcome to Talk of Today, where I interview experts in science, technology and society about developments in their fields and what they could mean for the future. I'm your host, Sam Barton. So before I get into it, just one or two announcements. Firstly, I've uploaded a few videos to the YouTube channel, so check them out. One is on how much would it cost to crowdsource a solution to the clean energy crisis. And hint, it's less than 10% of global fossil fuel subsidies. The other one is on the automation revolution. So if you want to check them out, head to talkoftoday.com or go to the Talk of Today YouTube channel or Facebook page. They're posted there. Also, the digital productivity tool I've been working on, LifeTab, is now available on the Chrome store. Head to talkoftoday.com and go to the LifeTab page to install it. Just so you know, only those with the link can access it at the moment, because I haven't officially released it yet. There are some changes that I'd like to make before making it widely available. But in a nutshell, it's a program that pops up every time you open up a new tab. It acts as a to-do list and as a data tracker for things like sleep, exercise, meditation, and a few other things. So some exciting developments underway, so stay tuned. So the next podcasts coming up are on some really fascinating topics. The first one is on anti-aging with Aubrey de Grey, and we basically talk about how we might live forever. There is a very, very realistic possibility that those who live for the next 1 to 3 decades may live to 1,000. So let that sit for a minute. And the other interview is on the future of food with Dr. Liz Specht from the Good Food Institute. And basically we talk about, just like I said, the future of food. Things like lab-grown meat, plant-based meats, and all that fun stuff. And that was a really fun conversation. These are developments that may not only drastically reduce our impact on the climate, but also reduce suffering in the world by a significant amount. And by suffering, I mean the suffering of animals. And how we quantify that and measure that or compare that to our own suffering is a whole nother question. But I digress. And that video is actually going to be available on YouTube as well, so you can watch the podcast or listen to it, so it's up to you. Anyway, on to today's episode. The topic for this episode is concussions. Towards the end of last year, I chanced upon a publication from the Queensland Brain Institute called The Brain. The entire issue was on the science of concussions. When I was in high school, I used to do a bit of boxing, and I'd been considering getting back into it. But given the fact that it's a sport where the main target is your head, combined with the news and research about concussions coming out across the world, I was having second thoughts. So I decided to reach out to the Queensland Brain Institute to chat and explore the topic in more detail. Today, my guest is Dr. Fatima Nasrallah, one of the senior scientists looking into traumatic and mild brain injury at the Queensland Brain Institute, which is based at the University of Queensland. So I present to you my conversation with Dr. Fatima Nasrallah.
I'm Fatima Nasrallah, working as a senior scientist at the Queensland Brain Institute, University of Queensland, and my research is mainly focused on traumatic brain injury and mild brain injuries, or what we call concussions.
Mm-hmm. And I became aware of your work, as I said previously, a couple months ago, with the first edition of The Brain, which is a publication or a magazine that the Queensland Brain Institute has just started. Is that correct? It's a new.
Yes. So yeah. It's a new sort of edition of a magazine, or probably the first edition that was on concussion, and it focused on NFL players and concussion around NFL players, what the symptoms of concussion are, how we can diagnose them, and what we're doing to be able to contribute to the field of concussion.
So what exactly is a concussion?
As I said, there's a sort of extreme range of a brain injury, and concussion is basically a brain injury. So you have the extreme of a traumatic brain injury, which is very severe, and you have the very mild extreme, which is what we call a concussion. And a concussion is basically an impact to the brain. So you've hit your head, but the knock is not sort of visible. So you don't have a scratch, you don't have a fracture of a bone. And so what happens if you have to envisage your brain as like a small jelly type, a small jelly, and that's in a cushion of fluid around it, and then you have the hard case, which is like a metal skull also. And so what happens is that this brain, or this jelly, which we call the brain, is always protected by this fluid around it. And so it swims in this fluid, and if you hit your head against the wall, this fluid sort of serves as a concussion so that the brain inside doesn't hit to the skull. But when you're playing sports, or when you've had a car accident and that force is really hard, so the acceleration is so high, the brain inside hits to the skull very forcefully, and that cushion of fluid is no longer a cushion because the force has been so hard from the acceleration or the whiplash, acceleration, deceleration impact. And so that's what we call the brain bruises, because it hits onto the skull from the inside. So most of the time they're not visible bruises to the brain. You can get multiple bruises, you can get one bruise. The severity of it really depends on the symptoms that you get. And it might be less severe, but you might have more symptoms because that depends on the region of the brain that has hit to the skull. And this is what makes it so variable and so hard to understand in a way.
What are the symptoms of a concussion? Because I'm sure, as you just mentioned, if a different part of the brain gets hit, the symptoms could vary. So I feel like it could be quite hard to know when someone is indeed concussed, depending on the severity.
It really depends on the severity. So it depends, most doctors, if you go to a doctor after you've had a concussion, if you've realised that you've had a concussion, screen for more than 25 symptoms or signs of a concussion. So you might have dizziness, you might have vomiting, you might have just a mild headache, you might have blurriness in the vision. These are all symptoms that they look for. But if, say for example, you're playing soccer or you're playing football, and you do have a concussion, some people don't even feel that they've had a concussion. Some people get knocked out from a concussion, and that's where the severity lies. The thing is that you can get an onset of symptoms right immediately after a concussion, and then you know that you've had a concussion, but sometimes the onset of symptoms can be delayed by a week or so, and that's when you start getting the symptoms. So it's
hard to know whether or not what you're
it's hard to know.
Is because of the impact rather than
something else that you've
exactly.
And that's where it becomes much harder for doctors to identify, are these symptoms that you're having because you had a concussion, and whether you remember whether you've had a concussion. And a lot of things that contribute to that is that you've had a concussion and you still engage in other activities that might cause another concussion that might be milder, but has more severe consequences of the brain, because the brain is still trying to heal from the first concussion or the first injury. So there's a lot to think about and lots of variables that you need to take into account to assess what a concussion, what you've had for a concussion, what the symptoms may be, and how they reflect on different types of individuals.
So when the brain gets bruised, what actually happens on the cellular level? Like, what's actually causing I'm sure it is somewhat complex, but could you comment, or just
in very simple terms? The brain is made of cells that function in a normal manner every day. So you have cells that take up energy, and they take up nutrients to perform the daily activities, for example. Now, if that part of the brain is bruised, obviously that cell is damaged. So the way it takes up the energy, the way it takes up nutrients, the way it functions with the rest of the cells around it, because they all form a homogeneous sort of system-like way of performance, it just doesn't function the right way anymore because it's damaged. And depending on how severe that damage is, it can either recover with time, or it can sort of cause further damage downstream to other cells around it, and then the consequences become more severe. Okay. I think there's not much information out there on, there's a range of things that might happen to the cell. So, you might get edema, you might get energy disruptions, you might get I don't know what type of molecular pathways that would get damaged, but it's really hard to pinpoint, especially from the research that's available on concussion, what the background or the underlying pathology is, especially from a single cell. So in the human brain, we can't pick up those changes, and that's why we go back to preclinical studies where we use animals to be able to identify at that single cellular level, can we detect those changes? So for example, in animals you can do single electrode recording, so you can put a needle into the brain or an electrode, and it can measure the potential of a cell and how it's functioning, or the neural activity of a cell. And
didn't we discover something earlier on this year? I think it was done at Berkeley, UC Berkeley or something, where I can't remember, but it's something like the part of the brain, part of the neurons are far more active. I'm going to look this up because I think it was the active Berkeley, because it changes. It's the no, it doesn't matter. Ignore me. Move on. I wish. Because I messaged my friend Sri that I was telling you about because I saw some headlines, and it's really easy for publications, or not publications, but just the shitty journalism in the world, and they just take a headline and then they just run with it. So I said, hey, what is the significance of this? And he said, oh, this is actually quite significant. But it's obviously not significant enough for me to not remember it, so we'll move on.
Okay.
So how long can a concussion last? Because I understand there's something called post-concussion syndrome.
So it's basically they refer to post-concussion syndrome is referred to the symptoms that you get. So based on the symptoms, you either have the syndrome or not. Mm-hmm. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can either get the symptoms immediately after the concussion, and they might go away the next day or the next week or so, and you might have long-lasting effects of concussion. So for example, you might have heard of the rugby player Justin Clark. He had symptoms from a concussion last up to 2 years following his concussion. Very debilitating effects. So he was an aeronautical engineer who was a very bright student at uni. And after his second or third concussion, it went down track. So he started getting very, very bad headaches. He wasn't able to do just even the simple tasks of understanding what he read, of doing simple tasks at home. Even walking became hard for him. And it took him about 3 months to be able to start getting back on track, but he was still couldn't remember things. He had a very significant deficit in memory. Even going back to university to do his modules, for example, it would take, he couldn't do them all at once anymore. So he had to do one every semester and then, accumulate those over time to be able to. So you look at these consequences and you think, he's a rugby player who's been playing maybe, ever since he was a young child. But the only concussions that he can remember of are only 1 or 2. And it was only that third one, for example, that really sort of surfaced the symptoms that weren't there before. So, and this is what's become a very hot topic at the moment in terms of the repetitive injuries that you might get and the time frame between those injuries. So one thing we don't know is how long does it take for a concussion to repair itself? Now, why do some concussions last for years, months? Why do some concussions only last for a week and then the symptoms are gone? And when they do last for months, how long does it take for them to repair? And so if you've had one concussion where you don't get any symptoms after that, how long has it taken the brain to recover from that one concussion? If you get no symptoms, does that mean that your brain has not been injured or has not been bruised in a sense? And then you go ahead and still on the field, you're still playing and you get another concussion. You say, this is the concussion that really caused these severe symptoms. But is it that repetitive injury that you've had that's accumulated this severe injury to the brain that's caused it to surface as a very bad health-threatening symptom also?
So any impact on the brain that causes a little bit of damage is classified as a concussion, even if there are no symptoms? Like any
Yes, any impact
So
to the brain.
even the smallest
Yes,
impact is
so
a
it's
concussion.
really hard to say.
It feels like a big spectrum of
It is
what
a very,
could be
it's a very big spectrum. But the thing is that we don't know what's happening on the inside of the brain. So you can see now in the NFL they have these sort of bands which they put on the head to assess the pressure or the force of the impact when a concussion happens. And so there's a red light that comes up or a green light that says, oh, you've passed this sort of threshold. Below that, the concussion's not as hard, but above that, the concussion's too hard and you have to be off the field. And these are sort of research type bands which they're sort of wearing to assess whether they can detect how hard the impact was. The one thing that gets to me is that, even though I say, for example, this is the threshold where above that you have to be off the field or below that you can still stay on the field, we can't measure what's happening inside the brain. All we can measure is the outside. What's the impact? But what does this impact or threshold convert to when you relate it to the bruise that's on the brain? If you moved your head back and forth like that, that cushion is still, the liquid inside still protects it, so you don't get that hard. But if you've, hit your head across a ball and the force is so hard that the brain has moved back and forth inside the skull, that's what really determines what the impact of the injury is.
I understand your work at the moment is looking into the biomarkers concussions produce. Is that right? So how we can actually measure
exactly
the effect.
So what we're trying to do is be able to look at the biomarkers that can allow us to assess the severity of that injury, even if it's very mild. So, for example, if you've had an injury in the brain, you were talking about cellular changes or at the level of the cell, what's happening. So when that cell becomes stops working, for example, or or it gets damaged, it starts secreting things to tell you that it's damaged. Secreting markers like an axon marker or a protein that's because that cell maybe broke down. Then the proteins in it broken down, they get secreted out into the blood, for example, or into the cerebral spinal fluid. It gets secreted somewhere into the body, so that you can then probably measure that as a reflection of the damage that's happened. So if you've had, for example, 100 cells that have been damaged and broken down and you get secretions, those secretions are going to be less than when you have maybe 1,000 cells. This is just a sort of trying to make the picture a bit more simple in terms of, but the numbers are not right, obviously. And so you obviously get more secretions into the blood, and the levels of the proteins in the blood are much higher compared to when you have less damage, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so trying to assess what these markers are that are being secreted into the blood. So taking, for example, normal people or prior to an injury and then post-concussion, and then see if you've done a screening of 20 or 30 markers, and you know that these markers have increased after the concussion, that can give us sort of an idea where we can correlate the severity of the concussion. So if somebody has been knocked out due to a concussion versus somebody who's had a mild concussion where they don't see much symptoms, but we know that there's been that impact on the field, how does that reflect in terms of the concentration or the amount of these markers that have changed after a concussion? And so it can give us an idea. So hopefully we can get to a stage where if you've had a game and you've gone, and had an impact or been knocked out or went to the hospital, if you just take a blood sample or a saliva sample, you should be able to determine the levels of these markers, and based on these levels, you can say, it's taken you a week for these levels to come back down, which is sort of representative of the brain has healed itself compared to maybe months where those markers are high and there's something that's contributing to that.
And it'd be great to get a test in real time, just to be able to, you bumped your head, you come off the field, do a saliva swab.
Exactly.
Any markers present.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to that stage. It's just very early at the moment because it's just we're still at a stage where we really don't understand what's happening. First you have to understand what's happening. Then you have to get the diagnostic ways to diagnose what's happened, and then third you have to once you know what is changing, you can create treatments for that, or you can advise on certain precautions that can be done.
So what actually happens when you lose consciousness? Is there some sort of threshold that we cross where the brain's like, nope, we're going to turn off the lights for a few seconds? Do we know what causes a loss of consciousness where an impact is concerned?
I don't know what causes that sort of switch, to tell you the truth, that, you know, you're sort of okay and then you've lost consciousness. But it's all related to blood pressure, it's related to your peripheral system, apart from the brain as well.
Okay.
So, you know, if you have loss of blood
for
to
a couple seconds,
yeah, and that's
Okay.
yeah, and so the peripheral system has much more to play in terms of that compared to the brain, because obviously your brain hasn't gone dead; it's still functioning. But also you know, what the impact of loss of consciousness on long-term effects of the brain is also an interesting topic, because if you've had an impact and you've been knocked out or loss of consciousness most of the time relates to loss of oxygen to the brain, for example. So you get hypoxic, and hypoxia is one of the main detrimental effects of brain function.
Okay.
We know that, you know, when you get hypoxic, so people who go up to very high mountain climbers, they get very hypoxic. And so brain function deteriorates more when you have hypoxia. So a loss of consciousness is sort of a second of that, you know, and how frequent it happens might contribute more to the severity of the symptoms that you see, or the long-term consequences that you see. So it's
not good.
Yeah, no.
What about the use of helmets in sports? Do they have any impact at all on the brain and on limiting the effects of, or the potential effects of, a concussion?
I mean, what we've said so far, if we understand what concussion is,
there's no impact at all.
Theoretically or logically, you wouldn't say that a helmet would have any positive or negative impact on the progression of
unless
what
it crumpled a sufficient amount. Unless there was a lot of crumple, as if it was like a car. If it crumples, it absorbs the energy. But if it's like a nice hard helmet, then your brain's gonna be bouncing around regardless.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And not only that, I mean, I would think that, you know, my view on this is that helmets only help in terms of external fractures, but on the inside, what's happening, it's all related to the force.
Yeah, and if anything, they give you a false sense of security. I mean, watching the NFL players, they are crazy. They are flying weapons. Yes. They just launch
and it's
themselves.
Because they have, you know, I think they'd probably take, they think about it twice before doing it if they didn't have a helmet.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Yeah, and so that's, and it's definitely a false sense of security. So, in any way, my thought on it would be that it probably has a negative impact on the progression of a concussion compared to without having a helmet, for example, because you're more cautious when you don't have one.
So looking into you know, the different football codes and the experiences of some of the players down the line, you know, maybe retired players, what have they experienced in terms of brain health after you having retired?
So, I mean, it really depends, you see. So some players have played all their life and have concussions throughout their whole career, and they don't suffer from any debilitating cognitive deficit or so. They seem to function normally. I mean, in terms of IQ, I can't sort of say, but you know, there's different factors that play a role in that. But at least from the studies that have come out from NFL players, for example, which is a huge amount of studies, amount of players that have been invested post-mortem wise, we know now that there is a relationship between you having repetitive concussions over time and early onset of dementia, for example. So we know that they have low physical, low mental health, low cognitive health earlier on. And that raises the question as to why some people play, for example, rugby throughout their whole life, or play any type of sports that they're at risk of multiple concussions throughout their life and have no issues, and others that do have very debilitating issues or health conditions earlier on, like say at the age of 40 or 45. Which has sort of raised the issue as to whether concussion predisposes you to early onset of dementia. And this is a very, very hot topic at the moment, because that may be the case. If you're damaging cells over and over again, obviously you're at the age of 40 or 45, where you're supposed to be at the peak of your mental health, you're getting degeneration of the brain that looks similar to Alzheimer's disease, and that's what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And so this has been a very significant light that's been put onto these type of players, because I don't know what kind of other factors. I mean, obviously they might have different types of products that they have. They might be alcoholic, which might contribute to the consequences. But we also think that, there might be a genetic predisposition to having long-term effects of concussion. So your genetic makeup or your body or your environmental exposure makes you more prone to getting long-term consequences from a concussion compared to other people.
I've heard that the use of cannabis can have neuroprotective qualities when concussions are concerned. Have you heard anything about that? Because I know that in the NFL, a lot of players are using it. Yeah, I mean,
it's not only cannabis. There's other products as well. There's not been those solid, robust studies which have looked into that. I mean, to be able to make a clean sort of comment on that, you'd have to have a clean study population where you've invested in looking at that. I mean, there's lots of things that can have neuroprotective effects, and it's really hard to say whether cannabis has contributed to that or not before we understand whether, you have
there's so much going on in people's lives.
Just
to take that one variable and say
yes, exactly.
Is very, very hard.
I mean, and you probably need very, very large, like a big study of thousands of players versus those players who have not taken cannabis to be able to make that kind of conclusion.
Yeah.
So it's quite inconclusive from the small sample sizes that they use in current studies.
Definitely.
Yeah.
With regards to children and contact sports, what are they at greater risk or at less risk, or what's your opinion on what do we know where kids are concerned?
It's hard to say. I mean, but the one thing in my view is that, kids the brain is still developing up until the age of your 20s. It's in this phase of changing. And so if you alter that sort of phase while it's in this developing mode, it can be altered for the worst or for the better, who knows. So if you've damaged it in a sense, and it's just and it's already in an ever-changing environment that's changing all the time because they're developing, they're being exposed to new environments and being exposed to everything that's new in their life. The brain is still trying to cope. Connections between the brain are still building up because that's the whole point, that's the whole basis of how we function. Connectivity between different brain areas, how you can connect one brain region to another one and how they interact with each other and how they communicate. And if you alter that, I think it would have more severe consequences than to a brain which is already, the adult brain, which is already developed and can cope with an injury or a damage or an alteration in a different way than to a developed brain.
So is and this could be somewhat controversial, but is the answer to not engage in these contact sports, or just to really question, really take a hard look and think, is this worth the potential ramifications down the track?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think that we should say that, we don't want to play sports. It's a very important part of our lives. You need to play sports. It's physical, mental development, sports in a sense. So nothing needs to sort of be put in grounds that you have to stop playing sports. Just because this is a risk. There's a risk you're walking on the street and getting hit by a car. There's a risk. I mean, the risks obviously increase when you play sports.
I hit my head all the time opening doors, and I'm clumsy, and I've probably gotten some sort of
exactly. My son does the same thing. He just hits his head on the floor every day, and so it's not about sport. I think it's more taking observing, and taking a look and questioning. If you do have an impact, or if you observe an impact, what you need to do to lessen the effect of that impact on your child, for example. So I think this is where parents have to stand and sort of say, initially, mostly before concussion became a big topic, people used to just ignore it. Oh, he had a bump on his head with his mate during rugby or during football, or I don't know, during tennis, although it's very unlikely in tennis. But and then he's had a headache, and then he goes back onto the field. And I think this is where parents or rugby teams or players or friends have to sort of, put a stop to that and sort of say, no, this has to be looked at more seriously, because it is serious. the injury might be of very low impact in the beginning, but if that person goes back and has another concussion just because they went back on the field without being precautioned as not to do that, the consequences may be severe, and we know that they are. It is a damage to the brain. We can't say other than that. It is. You've had an impact, you've had an injury. Obviously,
damaged.
yeah, the brain has been bruised.
Literally brain damaged for a little bit.
You know, you bruise your knee and you sit aside for an hour or two because it's bruised. You bruise your brain, but nothing happens to it. It doesn't mean it hasn't been bruised. And I think that's what's significant about the brain, because it still functions. It's a very complex organ, very vital and very dynamic. You know, that's what's interesting about it. But it also gets damaged, and we can't detect that. All we can do is take precautions. From the studies we know, there is a serious impact of a concussion on the brain, and what we need to do is, you know, limit it from getting worse. In the sense that we don't have ways to detect it at the moment. You know, I mean, if you're getting to a stage where you have very severe symptoms like vomiting and dizziness and blurred vision and massive headaches and severe headaches, you know, obviously that impact has been quite high. It's not just a very mild impact, you know, and it may recover after a week because the brain has had time to sit down and recover. It's just like when you sleep. Your body has nothing else to do but to take care of repairing your body and repairing any damage that's happened to it. So obviously you need to sit down and let it repair itself, because if it has to take care of doing something else at the same time when it's repairing, it doesn't repair it in a proper way.
Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I hope you learned something, because I definitely did. I had no idea that any type of brain injury like that was called a concussion, so there you go. So if you would like to support this podcast, you can share it with your friends, like it on Facebook. But if you really want to support it, you can become my patron. So just head to talkoftoday.com or patreon.com/talkoftoday, and for about $1 a month, you can become a supporter of this podcast, and that would change this game for me. But that's only if you really, really support this. I think each episode will equate to about 25 cents each, so if you are deriving at least that amount of value, please consider it, because I'm supporting myself a couple of days a week through doing a job that is okay, but I'd prefer to work on this sort of stuff full time. And I have committed to not running any ads on this, so your support and anything else is the only way that I can make a living from this. So it is greatly appreciated. Everything discussed in this podcast can be found at talkoftoday.com, or in the show notes, which will be at talkoftoday.com/podcast-3, because I need to update that little URL thing. So yeah, just head to the podcast and, God, what am I saying? Head to the website and you'll find all the links mentioned. And from the sounds of it, there are some cool job opportunities working in an industry which, from the sounds of it, will have a tremendous impact on the world. Anyway, I'll wrap up here. Thanks again.